This talk is about Alberta's land use, its history, where it is today, and where it's going. It's a presentation prepared by the Elsie's Group and the Alberta Land Institute at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. How do you picture Alberta? For some, it's about our majestic mountains, the wonderful scenery. For others, it's the beautiful cities, Edmonton, Calgary, and all the rest. It could be the endangered species like caribou that is most important. For some, it's the history of our agriculture, such as livestock. It could be the charismatic megafauna, the grizzly bears. The energy sector, which drives our economy today. The forestry sector of northern Alberta and our boreal forests. For many, we're third, fourth generation agriculturalists. For some, it's the fiscal performance of the province, or our ability to find jobs. For others, however, it's water quality and quantity. For some, it's jobs, royalties, and rents. For some, maybe myself, it's about me now. For others, it's about them, their kids, their grandkids. If you ask most Albertans, they'd probably say it's all of those things. You know, we want to satisfy our needs today. Yes, we want our grandkids to do well. But it's about jobs, royalties, and rents, about having agriculture and forestry and energy and transportation and residential. And somehow we're smart enough to fit all of this together in space and time and have the Alberta advantage. Well, that ideology probably served us reasonably well in the last century, but Alberta is becoming progressively a smaller place. It's becoming busier. We need new ideas, new paradigms, new ways of planning. And this talk tries to introduce some information that's going to help us navigate towards these new conversations. We're going to walk down the corridor of Alberta, look at how we got to where we are today, look at some of the policies that are driving us into the future. What benefits do they generate? And there's always lots of benefits. But equally importantly, let's talk about the liabilities. All job types, all land uses create liabilities. We need to discuss those too. So we're going to put a magnifying glass on Alberta and look into the suite of overlapping land use practices that have defined this wonderful province. It'll be important for us to look at the last 200 years. How did we get there? Where are we today? And rather than just marching forward, let's start talking about a vision. Let's define where we should be in 50 or 100, maybe 200 years, and ask ourselves what policies would shape this province and actually take us from where we are to where we want to go. We can call that management by objective, and we can actually explore the consequences of alternative policies and explore not only their benefits, but also their liabilities, see which ones take us to where we want to go, and how that province changes through time as we do so. This is critically important. This is called management by objective. Now, it's important for Albertans to understand that land use is never static. It's forever changing. So if we look at a history of Alberta, we could remind ourselves there was a time where all land uses were being made by First Nations, and they had been for tens of thousands of years. Well, those people are no longer the dominant land use, obviously, in Alberta. And they were replaced by the next land use practice. There was actually a time in Alberta where almost all people were working directly or indirectly with the harvest of bison. And that land use was replaced by trapping. And that land use was gradually replaced by the arrival of forestry and mining. And then came the emergence of agriculture, which has defined this province for many, many decades, but is not nearly as important, at least economically, as it was 4 or 5 decades ago. Today, the dominant land use is that of the hydrocarbon sector. And as we explore and extract and process and translocate hydrocarbons, it now drives our economy. It's the most important land use from the standpoint of political leverage. So what have we learned? Land use has changed through time. So it's important to ask what land use practices will drive us into the future. We've just seen that they're forever changing. So as we move into the future, will we remain on a trajectory of hydrocarbon? Will we explore, for example, nanotechnology? Will we be known for generating electricity? Will the defining feature of Alberta be the Edmonton-Calgary corridor? Will we move towards renewable energy? Are we going to continue to see a push towards secondary processing of natural resources? Are we going to become high-tech? Are we going to be defined by tourism and recreation? Or maybe some combination of all. But what we know is land uses continue to change, so it's important, it's critically important for us to ask ourselves where we're going to go and what are the benefits and liabilities of getting there. We need to remind ourselves that Alberta is shaped, again, by a series of overlapping land use practices. They include forestry, energy, mining, transportation, the cropland industry, livestock, our human populations and the residential patterns, how we sleep, where we sleep. Do we sleep in cities or suburbia or agricultural farms or rural residential? What about the First Nations people? What role do they play? What role will they play in the future? What about the land uses such as protected areas, tourism and recreation, hunting, fishing, and trapping? Once very common, now much less so, or other assorted industries. These land uses collectively give us the Alberta that we have and will give us the Alberta of the future. So we need to think about those. Now here we're seeing an image. It's called a dark sky image. It actually shows light emission from every land use. And as you look at Alberta, you get to see it's exceptionally special relative to its north, south, east, and west neighbors. It glows with brilliant light. That's land use intensity. And there's a very tight fit between land use intensity and GDP. So the brighter the landscape, the more active the economy is. And that's because of the rate at which we're producing commodities. Now I'm going to roll through a series of numbers here that look at the rate at which we produce wood fiber, whether it be hardwood or softwood, or hydrocarbons, whether it be coal or natural gas or conventional oil or bitumen, or production of livestock, whether it be beef or swine or chickens. And you can read these numbers for yourself. The key point here is that you couldn't find any other chunk of North America of size of Alberta, which is 66 million hectares, that has the same overall pace and tempo of land use production. This is a superheated economy producing natural resources at a pace that's almost unparalleled anywhere in North America. So to do that, however, we had to significantly change the landscape. We have converted 11 million hectares of native grassland, parkland, and the southern part of the boreal forest into croplands. That's 17% of Alberta. Another 14 million hectares today is dedicated to production of livestock. Another 24 million hectares is allocated for commercial wood production. These are the forest management agreement areas of Alberta. That's 36% right there. 250,000 hectares approximately in cities and towns, 340,000 hectares in acreages. So we have more land directly tied up in yards of acreages than we do in all of our cities. Okay, 14% of all Albertans actually live on acreages. 1.1 million hectares directly in the footprint of the energy sector. That's the seismic lines, well sites, pipelines, and processing plants. 400,000 hectares in transportation. So these are the minor roads and the major roads and rail. And at least 30,000 hectares in recreation. So if you add all those up, of the 66 million hectares that defines Alberta, over 51 million hectares is currently in direct footprint of land use or allocated for it. So we need to start thinking about Alberta essentially in an architectural fashion. We need to plan it, much like we would if we're building a house. We need to account for all of the areas and ask ourselves, how is this province going to be built? I mean, think of it metaphorically as a series of rooms, bathrooms and kitchens and dining rooms, basements. What are we going to do and where are we going to do it? As we move past this era of thinking that we can do everything everywhere all the time, the opposite of that is actually planning by objective. Where are we going to get our food? Maybe in the future we need to get our food much closer to our settlements. Are we going to produce hydrocarbons? If so, where? How do we move on the landscape? Where do we accommodate our recreational needs? Where do we live? So we need to start thinking about this province almost in an architectural fashion. So what is the blueprint that our grandkids and great-grandkids would be most pleased with and would suit their needs best in the future? We need to be thinking about that. So as we make these tough, though balanced decisions, we need to be thinking at different scales. We need to be able to think at the scale of the entire province. We also need to think about regions. And this is what the Alberta Land Use Framework is about, is thinking about regional differences in what will comprise Alberta. So ultimately, we need a conversation about the desired architecture of Alberta. As we move away from the concept of everyone doing everything everywhere all the time, we're going to move towards, again, management by objective. Let's visualize what this province should become and ask ourselves what suite of policies would take us from where we are to where we want to go. So at the core of all land uses are humans. So we've got humans in Alberta. So let's take a look at these populations and where they live. Here we're looking at a time series going from 1900 to today, showing the location of all the cities. Now if I stop here in around 1930, 1940, about 80% of all Albertans lived in rural settings. But as the decades march forward and we move towards that 3.6 million people that define Alberta today, you can nicely see the filling in of the Edmonton-Calgary corridor, where 3 out of 4 of Albertans live today. 80% of all Albertans live in cities and towns, and 3 out of 4 of all Albertans live in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. So it shows you that there's one part of the province that is clearly dedicated to primarily residential. Now, if we look at it in a different format here, and this is actually looking at it township by township, we can see it growing through time. And again, stopping in the 1930s and 1940s, how a lot of the people lived in urban settings. And as we march forward into these more recent decades, the Edmonton to Calgary corridor glows bright red. You can also see Fort McMurray and Red Deer and Medicine Hat, Grand Prairie, those types of communities. But the Edmonton-Calgary corridor is where the vast majority of the action is in terms of residential. Now, if we switch away from the cities to those people living outside of cities, which means they're either living on acreages or they're living on farmyards, here we get to see the distribution. And again, in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, most people living not in cities were on farms. But as the decades move forward, most of these people now live still in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. These are the rural residential people that are commuting to cities but don't want to live in cities. And they represent about 14% of Albertans. So 80% living in cities, 14% living in acreages, and the remaining 6% are the people that are actually living on operational farms. So if we compare where we are today at 3.6 million people, which has been growing at about 1.8% per year on average historically, and we move that into the future, by 2055, we'll basically be adding about 3.9 million people. So one of the key questions is, where will they live? Now, we can also ask ourselves, where are they coming from? Now, historically, a lot of our growth in the last several decades is by fecundity, childbirth, actually inside of Alberta. But now, in the last few years, we've actually switched over, so we have more immigration than we have childbirth. And this is occurring both interprovincially and internationally. So immigration is a very important driver pushing our population higher, and largely driven by the relatively low unemployment and the significant demand for new workers as various land uses, primarily the hydrocarbon sector, tries to meet that demand. Now, there's been some fascinating changes in human population over these decades. In 1905, the average population was the average family size was 4 people per family. And by the early 50s, that had grown to about 6 people, and now has been declining every decade since, and down to about 3 that we have today. So about 3 people per family, and continues to drop. Okay, so it's gone from 4 all the way up to 6.5 and then down to 3. So family sizes are getting smaller. Interestingly enough, as our family sizes become smaller, the actual size of houses in terms of square footage per person is actually increasing. So it's gone from 19 square meters back in 1905 to 34 square meters, and it's going to continue to grow even further. So our families are becoming smaller, our homes are becoming bigger. You might ask, why is that important? Well, it has a lot to do with urban sprawl, lot size, and demands on how we architecture our cities and the resources they need. Now let's illustrate that with Alberta's capital, Edmonton. In 1951, Edmonton was about 96 square kilometers, and there you get to see it. If we morph forward to 2007, Edmonton is now 433 square kilometers. And if it continues to grow in area in the future at the same pace it has historically, it would become over 2,000 square kilometers by 2057, significantly consuming the wonderful agricultural soils around Edmonton and forever making a decision that urban sprawl is more important than soil fertility or ability to grow crops. So are we aware of that trade-off? Because that is the pattern we're actually observing. And our current policy, to a large extent, will continue that pattern. Calgary is not a grossly dissimilar story. Back in 1951, 93 square kilometers. If we grow it to 2007, 580 square kilometers. And if it continues to grow in area in the next several decades at the same pace it has historically, it's almost 3,000 square kilometers, consuming all the satellite communities around it. Again, growing faster in area than in population, hence in sprawl. And if you look at the major metropolitan centers right across Canada, The two leading cities in terms of sprawl are the two largest cities in Alberta. That's Edmonton and Calgary. It's really important for us to think about urban design. If we're going to put another, say, 4 million people in Alberta in the next 4, maybe 5 decades, most of them are going to live in cities, probably about 80%. So one of the key questions we have is whether these cities are going to grow out or grow up. Now, clearly they're going to do both, but the question is, what policies will drive them in what direction? If we choose to grow up and put most of our money in terms of infrastructural capital into communities where we're looking at public transportation, then there's some significant consequences. For example, as we grow up instead of out and focus on public transportation, we're going to have more walkable communities. That's going to reflect itself in terms of the average body mass of humans. That's going to reflect itself in turn to healthcare costs. There's very strong correlative signatures between how much we walk, how much we weigh, and what our healthcare costs are. Alternatively, if we choose to grow out and not up, we're going to see, again, people are going to get heavier, and there's going to be higher healthcare costs, but at the same time, we're going to see much more consumption of fuel, much greater emissions of greenhouse gases, which clearly has significant undesirable effects. If we grow out rather than up, we will increase the rate at which we're consuming peripheral agricultural lands. Many of these around cities are the best soils. When you think about where were the big cities obviously had to start as small. What started those communities? In Alberta, like many other places, it was 2 factors: really good soils and proximity to water. And that's the same with Edmonton, Calgary, Red Deer, Medicine Hat, Peace River, Fort McMurray, the same pattern, right? So if we continue to let these cities sprawl, they consume the surrounding agricultural soils and the natural landscape. So that essentially mines our ability to have a food-secure future. So we need to ask ourselves, what would happen if fuel prices were to spike? How able would we be to move food off our agricultural landscapes into our large cities? So as we continue to pave over the best agricultural soils we have in all of Alberta, there is clearly a price to be paid. But there's an economic argument not to grow out. As we grow out, the amount of money we spent in the construction and maintenance of infrastructure escalates. And so it's basically a fiscal sustainability issue. Cities that grow out generally are not sustainable from a fiscal standpoint. And we're certainly seeing that in spades in the municipalities of Alberta. So here we're looking at the amount of area that we have in all of our settlements, which right now is about 5,000 square kilometers in Alberta, growing to 14,000 square kilometers by 2055, meaning that 9,000 square kilometers or 900,000 hectares will be consumed by expanding cities and acreage complex between now and 2055. And that is an obscene number. That the consequences of doing that are not sustainable. So we need to be asking ourselves, why are we doing it? Now, one of the reasons, if you look at a quarter section basically selling, or a square kilometer selling for about $1.5 million per square kilometer, if we expand by those 9,000 square kilometers between now and 2055, that equates to about $14 billion. And it is more profitable for developers to grow out than to grow up. And there's about $14 billion of land sales available for those that hold those lands. So you can see there's a tremendous incentive for urban sprawl. But that strategy only makes sense when we're not doing a good job of internalizing many of these key indicators, such as water quality, water quantity, food security, and carbon. If we do a better job of understanding the value of those key commodities for society, then growing up becomes a much more desirable strategy than growing out. So just to illustrate that, here I'm showing on the right where people actually live in Alberta, and on the left the various soil types of Alberta. And what we're going to do is lay over the dominant Edmonton-Calgary corridor on top of those black Chirmozemic soils, what we might call the black loamy soils that have our highest productivity. And you can see that the Edmonton-Calgary corridor has this profound overlap with these great soils, and we're in the process of systematically paving them over. So this is certainly an undesirable effect. So as we think about the next 50 years, and we think about where we're going to put the next, say, 4 million people, we need to be asking ourselves questions about urban design and ecological goods and services. So what's at stake? Well, there's a bunch of things at stake. And basically, there's a dichotomy here. We can choose to grow out, or we can choose to grow up. And clearly we'll do both. The question is, where will the relative emphasis be? So one side of the equation is a continued dependency on suburbia and acreages. And in so doing, we'll continue to fill in the Calgary corridor, Calgary to Edmonton corridor, and we'll see significant infusions of money into construction and maintenance of infrastructure. And quite likely, we will not be able to afford to maintain the costs of that infrastructure through time. So that may not be the best strategy. The other is a focus on growing up. Urban design that makes communities walkable, mixed use, ones where public transportation are given priority. And the total amount of land that we'll consume for our settlements will be much smaller. And our ability to have surrounding soils to produce food, particularly close to cities, will be much greater because we won't be eating over those really good black chirmozemic soils. Now the benefits extend to many others too, such as soils and carbon, water quality, water quantity, wetlands, biodiversity, and we already talked about food production. But I think we need to remind ourselves that it could be a key question in terms of fiscal sustainability too. So, agriculture. Let's talk about agriculture. So if we look at this graph of how our crops have grown through time, we see that very quick growth in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and for a couple decades after the World War II, and then have gently increased and actually peaked in most recent decades. So here we're looking at our cereals and oilseed crops, a total of about 9 million hectares. So that doesn't include our improved pasture, which would bring another couple million hectares to our total crops. Well, if you see from this graph, it actually looks like we're going to start a slow decline in the total amount of area of croplands. Well, the true story is a little bit more complex, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes as we examine how our crops are growing, but also what's growing into them. But first, let's look at the last 100 years as we see our croplands expanding in our dry grass communities and our mesic grass communities through the grassland natural regions, moving west into the foothills, north into the parkland. We see the Peace River country begin to develop from a cropland standpoint, and the southern part of the boreal forest to the current amount of cropland we have in Alberta today. And it's been the most notable transformation of landscapes we've ever had in the province of Alberta, that tied to croplands. Okay, what we're seeing is that our croplands are expanding at about 4,000 hectares per year in cereals and another 4,000 hectares per year in our oilseed crops, so about 8,000 hectares altogether. But at the same time, the amount of our croplands that are being lost to roads, to the footprint of the energy sector and these expanding cities is about 15,000 hectares per year. And you get to see in this graph how it's increased. So we're losing our croplands at about 15,000 hectares per year, and we're gaining them at about 8,000 hectares per year. So the net difference is a loss of about 7,000 hectares or 70 square kilometers of croplands every year. And many of these losses are occurring on our best black chirmozemic soils. So interestingly enough, we're looking at losing about 1.1 million hectares of surrounding cropland between now and 2055. And that's a very difficult reality that we have to confront. Do we really want to lose over 1 million hectares of our best croplands? One of the reasons we need to think about that is food security. So if we look at the amount of cropland area per person in Alberta, when we first started, there was about, and this is back in say 1910, there was about 4 hectares of cropland for every Albertan. Well, that actually grew to about 5 in the 1950s and 1960s, and ever since then has been declining. We're now down to 2.3 hectares per person. Well, this big red line you see at the bottom of the graph is 0.8 hectares per person, and that is the amount of land every person needs to produce enough crop to support that person at this latitude. And we are dropping down and will be at that level sometime in the next 4 or 5 decades. So this province that's been known to produce and export crops actually may become a net importer of crops within the next 4 to 5 decades. So that's something we need to be thinking about. Now, let's continue that trend and talk about livestock. Here we're seeing the arrival of our livestock population, which is about 6 million head in terms of cattle, and you're getting to see it grow throughout Alberta's white area, the private land area, both south in the Peace River country. to about the 6 million head of cattle we have today. Now, on this graph, we get to see the supply and we get to see the demand. Demand is less than supply, so surprise, surprise, Alberta's history has been primarily one of exporting cattle. We have enough cattle to meet our provincial demand, and more so the surplus is exported. But the simulation we're conducting here in the LC's model, where we're looking at all of these business as usual policies and growing them out into the future, shows us that sometime in the next 3 or 4 decades, if our current dietary preferences remain about the same, the demand for livestock may actually exceed our supply, and again, we'd move into being a net importer. So that's something we really need to think about. Now, as time has marched on, we've changed the way in which we grow our cattle. They used to be, for the most part, extensive cow-calf operations, a lot of cattle on a lot of rangelands, and where we'd be butchering 3- and 4-year-old cattle. Now, as time has marched on, that's changed a lot, and now the majority of our cattle are raised in feedlot types of scenarios. And if you look at the direct area of the feedlot lots, plus the surrounding land that is largely uninhabitable because of essentially smell, you get to see here how it's changed through time. So there's about 6,000 square kilometers in Alberta that is uninhabitable because of feedlots right now, and that'll grow by another 2,000 square kilometers to 8,000 square kilometers by 2055. So we're seeing a very notable trend moving away from extensive approaches to raising our meat, these cow-calf operations on rangelands, to a very significant dependency on feedlots. And of course, they require a significant amount of inputs in terms of water and feed too. Now, continuing on this theme of intensification, whether it be the individual farm moving from relatively small herds to these massive herds that were found in feedlots, or the size of farms which used to be very abundant and quite small to relatively few that are massive in size, and how we manage them. And for example, our fence lines, it used to be quite structurally complex and good habitat for wildlife, like upland game birds, are now much more simple. So Alberta's witnessed a profound transformation in terms of the intensity in which we conduct agriculture. But that type of agriculture is entirely dependent on significant inputs in terms of water, often electricity, and particularly hydrocarbons. So we have to ask ourselves whether or not that is a kind of agricultural production we want in the future. So here we get to see our farms, which in 1930 was 120,000 farms in Alberta, is now down to 60,000 farms. So we've lost half our farms, and that will continue to decline. Now in this graph, we're actually looking at the amount of carbon in our soils and in our vegetation, all vegetation, whether it be crops or herbaceous vegetation or shrubs or trees, and showing that we've lost about 0.8 billion or 800 million metric ton over the last 50 years, and including what we will see between now and 2055. Well, that's a significant loss of carbon, largely because of crops, as we have significantly mined the amount of carbon in our agricultural soils. And that's why we've become so dependent on fertilizers, on nitrogen and phosphorus. So profound loss of that kind of carbon and the organics associated with that. And of course, that carbon is all up in our atmosphere. So a significant liability, primarily because of agricultural crops, but not only because of them, also because of commercial forestry and the ways in which we've grown our cities as they've expanded out, and the footprint of the transportation network. And here we're actually looking at a map going back to 1910, showing the loss of carbon primarily in the agricultural areas and our commercial forests over the last 10 decades. And you can see along the Rocky Mountains of southwest Alberta and up in the Precambrian Shield, there's very little carbon to begin with. But in the boreal forest and in our agricultural soils, we've seen a significant loss through time. Interestingly, if we look at this map, which shows, according to Alberta Agriculture, those portions of the white area where we conduct agriculture and where there's private property that are threats to biodiversity, there's a very nice agreement between that map, as we see on the right, and the LC's map on the left. Just reminding us that agriculture, in terms of how it converts natural plant communities to crops and how it affects water quality and water quantity, is probably one of the most important issues confronting biodiversity in the entire province of Alberta. So the LC's results and that of the government of Alberta are very similar. And in fact, if we look at, in this case on this slide, all of the different species that are either endangered or threatened or of concern, they're basically species that are found in the agricultural areas. Again, reminding us how important this land use is to changing plant community structure and water quality and quantity, and how it's influenced these species of concern. So let's move on to the forestry sector, a very important land use practice in Alberta. This particular map, going from 1905 up to today, shows, starting in the 1950s, the arrival of the forest management agreement areas that collectively today are over 20 million hectares of Alberta. So that's the amount of area that's in our forest management agreement areas, and about half of this area, which we see in orange, about half of it, about 10 million hectares, is merchantable forest land base, and that needs to be logged approximately once every century. So every 100 years, we will harvest about 10 million hectares. And of course, how we log our landscape significantly influences water quality, water quantity, carbon, wildlife habitat. So it's a very important land use practice. And unlike agriculture, which has basically converted almost all areas that it will, we're still very early on, like 1/3 our way through the first rotation, meaning that most of this area we have not yet harvested, and therefore it's a very, very early land use practice. Here we're looking at a graph that shows the desired cut for hardwoods and softwood, where we are today at about 14 million cubic meters per year. In terms of softwood, about 8 million cubic meters per year for hardwood, showing that it's by and large sustainable in the future, but that only applies if fire is not common. If we continue to have logging and we have fire, we're going to enter into a situation where maintaining current levels of cut are not likely to happen. We're harvesting about 80,000 hectares per year in Alberta, so that gives you an idea of just how much land is being affected. And here we get to see the cumulative amount of area that's been logged so far, about 2.6 million hectares. Remember, I said we have to harvest about 10 million hectares over 100 years. So by the time we get out to about 2055, we will harvest 7.3 million hectares, which means another 4.7 million hectares from today. So this is, second to agriculture, the second largest conversion of landscapes in terms of land use practices. But unlike agriculture that converts native plant communities into crops, how we log basically changes the age class structure of our forest, but not necessarily our composition in a fundamentally different way. The structure that's left behind after logging is largely dependent on how we log, and that's a very important conversation in terms of clear cutting versus shelter wood, or many of the other types of harvesting that we could conduct. So the total amount of wood that we've harvested so far is about 500 million cubic meters, 500 million cubic meters, and by 2055 it'll be at 1.6 billion. So another 1.1 billion cubic meters between now and 2055. Now the forest sector, particularly in areas that are steeper, such as the foothills or the lower parts of the mountains, when we actually log these forests, when we create cut blocks, they can contribute significant amount of sediment. And here these images are intended to show you that forestry, like any other land use practice, can influence water quality. And that, of course, that needs to be a higher priority as we identify the ways in which we want to log our forests in the future. Now let's move on to the hydrocarbon sector, or what we call the energy sector, which is clearly the most defining land use practice in Alberta today in terms of jobs, royalties, rents, fiscal performance. And here we're seeing a map starting in 1910 and showing you all of the natural gas wells that have occurred in the province of Alberta. So upwards of about 180,000 gas wells in the first 100 years. Well, let's roll back and look at conventional oil wells. Slightly different spatial pattern, but the same exponential increase in the amount of conventional oil wells over the last 100 years to about 60 to 70,000 producing conventional oil wells. So exponential growth. Now, crude bitumen, of course, did not start early in the last century, but it's been more of a recent phenomenon. Here we get to see it in the Coal Lake, Lloydminster, and Fort McMurray areas as our crude bitumen wells take off. So bitumen, most of it historically has been produced by surface mining. That which is not produced by surface mining is extracted with well-based technologies. We call them in situ mines, or in situ wells. So if we add up all the hydrocarbon footprint together throughout the entire province, whether it be conventional oil or natural gas or non-conventional gas or bitumen, here we get to see the pattern and unfolding through the province of Alberta. Now, of course, much attention on the Fort McMurray area, and rightfully so because of the bitumen extraction there. But if you look at all the conventional oil and gas and unconventional oil and gas and bitumen, you can see that there is a lot of activity in Alberta, and it's certainly not entirely in the Fort McMurray area. So even though there's a spotlight on that region, the footprint of the hydrocarbon sector is much more spatially distributed throughout Alberta. Now, this particular graph shows you cumulative production, and you can see in blue, line number 1, conventional oil, where we are today is very close to where the line becomes flat. We will not produce that much more conventional oil. It will grow for another 2 or 3 decades. In terms of natural gas in red, we're well over half our ultimate production, and it will continue to grow. So conventional oil and natural gas, those two particular oil and gas plays, we are more towards the end than we are towards the beginning. However, with respect to unconventional gas and with respect to bitumen, oil sands, these are embryonic land uses which have just started and have most of their development yet to occur. So we shouldn't in Alberta think of ourselves as someone that had an oil and gas history and it's largely over. In fact, in many ways, it's just begun. So if we look at the total number of wells that we've produced so far and drilled, about 250,000, and by the time 2055 rolls around, we'll be about 725,000. So we need to drill about 500,000 more wells in the next 4.5 decades between now, well, 4 decades between now and 2055. Now, as we drill all of these wells, we produce lots of area and edge associated with the footprints of those. And right now, historically, we've produced about 1.5 million kilometers of edge and 1.4 million hectares. So an edge would be like the length or the side of a well site or an access road or a pipeline. So a lot so far, and we have about 850,000 hectares more of area to produce between now and 2055, and 830,000 kilometers in edge. So if we think it's a busy landscape right now, it's only going to get busier. So all of these land uses we've discussed so far require transportation. We need to move goods, services, and people throughout the landscape. So transportation is by itself a land use practice, a very important one. So this graph looks at the changes in roads in Alberta over the last 100 years and where we're going to go. It shows that we have about 350,000 kilometers of roads in Alberta. Now, the majority of them are not inside of cities, they're actually outside. And up until about 2.5, 3 decades ago, almost all the roads we built in Alberta were public roads, paid for by the public purse, and they built the public road transportation network. A couple decades ago, that started to change significantly. And now, most of the roads we build are private roads, and they're going 3 places. They're going to cut blocks, they're going to well sites, and they're going to rural residential, they're going to acreages. So as these land uses unfold, and as our human population increases, by 2055, we should have around 740,000 kilometers of roads in Alberta. So we need to build about 400,000 kilometers of roads between now and 2055, given current policies and how these land uses are going to unfold. Well, that's an awful lot of roads. So it's more in the future than we already have today. So here you're actually seeing the transformation of Alberta in terms of roads. And again, the first highways, or not back then, they just would have been glorified trails coming in from the east and coming in from the south. The 20s, the 30s, and the 40s as we're building that 2 by 1 mile grid pattern throughout Alberta's white area. The 60s and 70s as we move to the significant number of hectares we have in roads today. And you see how it's grown profoundly and will continue to grow in the future. Now, roads allow us to access the landscape. And so Albertans are relatively young, and we're certainly very affluent as a people. So every day, and particularly on weekends, Albertans want to get out and recreate. And the roads built by forestry and oil and gas and mining and rural residential allow people to get out in the landscape very easily. So this province that seemed so big and so difficult to move around 4 or 5 decades ago is now very easy and very accessible in terms of dispersion and distribution of people. And that causes some profound problems with respect to various environmental variables. Many of our endangered species are quite sensitive to people and roads, and certainly water quality and quantity is also influenced by all the roads we build. So here we see a series of images of linear features created by forestry and energy and other land uses in Albertans using increasingly off-highway vehicles to move up and down these landscapes and along these linear corridors, and can have significantly adverse or undesirable effects on water quality and water quantity. So let's talk a little bit more about how we move around the landscape. Many people might be surprised that the total amount of, just on the personal vehicle side, that we have traveled 0.56 trillion kilometers so far. If you add up every person that's ever been in a personal vehicle since they arrived in Alberta, 560 billion kilometers of vehicular travel. And if we continue with the same dependency, and as our population grows, by the time we get to 2055, we'll be at about 2.8 trillion kilometers, which means we have another 2.2 trillion kilometers to travel between now and 2055. Well, of course, this requires a lot of fuel consumption. We've consumed about 57 billion liters of fuel for just personal vehicles. This has nothing to do with the commercial fleet, and that will increase exponentially to about 285 billion liters by 2055. So right now, current policies and general residential patterns and the way in which we move around the landscape will result in another 228 billion liters of fuel being consumed between now and 2055. Well, in terms of CO2, or CO2e, the equivalency of carbon dioxide, 140 million metric ton has been emitted just from Alberta on personal vehicles alone, and that will increase to about 700 million metric ton of CO2e by 2055. So again, 560 million metric ton of CO2e will be emitted in Alberta between now and 2055. So just on the basic first order principles, just on common logic, I think it's clear that we have to start thinking outside the box. We can continue this dependency on tremendous amount of travel in personal vehicles, but we can also ask ourselves some questions about alternative transportation. So if we're going to be traveling 2.2 trillion kilometers in the next 50 years, and we generally pay ourselves about 50 cents per kilometer for total depreciation, that's $1.1 trillion. Now we're going to be doing that, let's say over 50 years, that's a total of $22 billion per year of expenditures just on the personal vehicle side. So that should allow us to ask the question about whether this ongoing dependency on private transportation, where we're spending so much time each day in personal vehicles, is the best strategy versus some alternatives, such as a greater dependency on public transportation, mass transportation. And I guess one of the key questions is, why wouldn't we have that kind of example between Edmonton and Calgary? And the argument has been that it'd be too expensive, but we're looking at having $22 billion a year just in personal vehicle transportation costs. Certainly some of that could go to mass transportation. Now, another very important ecological good and service is that of water, both water quality and water quantity. In fact, I'd say the average Albertan would say there's nothing more important than water, and we'd probably trade off biodiversity or other things before water. So let's take a look at that. In terms of water demand, it's increased exponentially, and here we're looking at a map that's showing the total amount of water required per hectare in each of these townships in Alberta. And you get to see that, yes, the greatest demand is in southern Alberta in the white area associated with agriculture and specifically with irrigation. The Edmonton-Calgary corridor glows red, and that's the domestic water consumption required in basically meeting the needs of 3 out of every 4 Albertans. And yes, Fort McMurray is also bright, showing the amount of water required for bitumen. But certainly the oil and gas sector is not the only demand for water in the province of Alberta. Now, if we switch from water quantity to water quality, and here we're talking basically about relative changes in runoff on nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, we see how water quality has declined through time. And again, this is an association with all the land uses that are influencing how much fertilizer we put on the landscape, and hence agriculture is an overwhelmingly important determinant of water quality, but also sediment. And again, crops are very important there, but not only crops. So our transportation networks, our acreages, the footprint of the oil and gas sector, and forestry are all equally contributing to changes in water quality throughout Alberta. But here you get to see that the vast majority of changes in water quality are primarily in the white area, primarily driven by agriculture. So if we look at the total amount of water required to make Alberta tick for 1 year, it's about 6 billion cubic meters of water per year, and you can see that agriculture is the overwhelming demand side for water. Industry and mining, settlements, and the energy sector are there, but the agricultural sector, and particularly crops, and inside of crops, particularly irrigation, is the single greatest user of water today. Now the challenge is 80% of our water supply is north of Edmonton. And as we see in that map here, 80% of the demand side is south of Edmonton. So as land uses increase, and these southern watersheds have been systematically closed in terms of new allocations, there's going to be some adjustments made. Maybe much of the water, or some of the water that's currently being used by agriculture, is going to have to shift to other land uses that have a greater ability to pay for it. Alternatively, we may see a northern shift in land uses moving from more of the southerly latitudes to more of the central latitudes as they move from watersheds or basins that are fully allocated to more northerly basins that have not yet been closed. In other words, there's still additional water that can be taken out of these main stem rivers. So if we start to wrap up the story, what we see in terms of all the land use footprint is this change, as you're observing on this map through time, showing that this province that was fully characterized by natural plant communities has been profoundly changed in the last 100 years, collectively shaped by forestry, energy, agriculture, and transportation and residential patterns. And by far the largest footprint has been associated with the Edmonton-Calgary corridor and that of agriculture. So a significant change in the total footprint of the province of Alberta. Not only in area, but also in terms of edge, these linear features, the seismic lines, well sites, pipelines, roads that characterize all of these land uses. And one of the reasons ecologists talk a lot about edge is because it's a very important determinant explaining the performance of many of our wildlife species. A lot of our wildlife species are highly sensitive to edge because of direct edge effects or because edge brings people and their activities. So if we look at ecological goods and services, and in this particular case I'm talking about water quality, water quantity, and carbon, we see how it's declined in Alberta, primarily in the white area. And so Alberta's literally, incrementally, through time, diminishing its bank account in terms of ecological goods and services, natural capital. And things like water quality, water quantity, and carbon can be monetized. We can put dollar values on those. So we're seeing that we have lost a very important piece of Alberta's capital. Now we might ask ourselves, are all land uses having the same effect? So here what we've produced is look at the amount of footprint required by every land use to produce a unit of something. A unit of cow, unit of crop, which would be a cubic meter, a unit of energy, a cubic meter of oil, or a cubic meter of wood. And you see that some of these land uses, such as agriculture and cattle production, require an awful lot of land to produce something when compared to energy and forestry. So they don't all require the same amount of land to produce their commodity. Well, what if we shift to employment? Do they all provide equal amounts of employment? And what we see here very clearly in this graph is that the energy sector produces an awful lot more employment than forestry does, and forestry produces an awful lot more employment than that of agriculture once you standardize it per unit area of footprint. So some of these land uses require a lot more area to produce employment. On the economic side, one of the important contributions of land use is that they provide royalties. So here we're looking at agriculture, energy, and forestry, and look at the amount of royalties they pay per hectare of footprint they create. So the energy sector is creating about $11,000 of royalties to Alberta for every hectare that they influence. Agriculture doesn't provide any royalties, and for forestry it's about $295 per hectare. So on the royalty side, the energy sector is certainly contributing a lot. Now if we look at all land uses together, we're going to start in 1905. If we had the opportunity to fly over the entire province of Alberta and just keep track of every square meter of land use, we would find that it would be dominated in 1905 by grazing lands and croplands, and we'd be hard-pressed to find any area at all in settlements or any other land uses. They were there, but they were infinitesimally small. Now if we move ahead 100 years to where we are today, we can see that the amount of land and grazing area and croplands continue to dominate. Forestry is then the next most important, followed by the energy sector, transportation, and settlements. But if we move it forward 100 more years, we'll see that there'll be a significant increase in total amount of footprint. But that growth is not going to be in grazing lands and croplands. The vast majority of that growth is going to be in our forestry sector and our energy sector, transportation, and in settlements. So even though our grazing lands and croplands have defined our past transformations, they're not the ones that are going to grow that much more in the future. It'll be the other land uses. So here we are in 2012. We can look backwards, and here we see all the premiers that have led this province. We can ask ourselves over that period of time, what were the key drivers that led to the conversions in Alberta? We went through a cultivation era. We went through an era that we transitioned from extensive farming to very intensive farming. Some people call it clean farming. We had an era where we saw a rapid increase in the amount of livestock, particularly beef. We built a public road transportation network, and we saw the allocation of a significant amount of logging in these headwater systems. So those are the key drivers in the last 100 years, and those affected our ecological goods and services. Examples would be the incremental loss of our good soils because of agriculture and by the growing in of the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. We saw the loss of native prairie and parklands, and in association with that, tremendous arrival of exotic invasive plants. We saw a loss of significant biodiversity, particularly in the prairies and our parkland ecosystems. Our surface water bodies became significantly reduced, and I'm talking here primarily of the small ponds and the small creeks that were essentially drained to produce productive areas for agriculture back in a time, I guess, where we just really didn't understand how important those areas were in terms of storing carbon or for biodiversity or even just maintaining water quantity for crops. Our water quality significantly reduced because of all the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment that rolled into it associated with land use practices. Now, if we move forward, the drivers are going to be a little bit different. The key drivers in Alberta for the leaders of today and in the future are different and include the industrial heartland. As we move a significant amount of bitumen from the Fort McMurray area into the Edmonton region and process it, probably the most defining future driver will be that of the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. So right now, 3 out of 4 Albertans live there, so that 75% could continue into the future, but we're moving from essentially 3.6 to 5 to 7 to maybe 9 million people. So that's going to be a very busy part of the province. Probably 14% of Albertans will continue to want to live on acreages unless we provide other policies that discourage that. So rural residential will be a key driver, pushing off agriculturalists off some of the prime agricultural lands. We're moving towards more processing of commodities, whether it be hydrocarbons, agriculture, or livestock, which in many ways is a good idea from an economic perspective, but people better ask themselves, what are the inputs for processing bitumen or crops or livestock? They all require water. Where's that water going to come from? Is it available? And as those particular land uses use the water, who goes without? We're going to continue to displace agriculture from the best soils, but that agriculture will go somewhere else, and it'll generally go to soils that are not as good, and there'll be some significant consequences there. To compensate for that, we'll see a continued movement towards intensification of agriculture. Greater dependencies on nitrogen, phosphorus, insecticides, herbicides, phytovars, or genetic variations of plants that can do well in more soils that aren't as fertile or climates that are changing. So unless we change our policies, we're moving towards more intensive agriculture. And recreational demand increases. So the province, young and affluent, recreation increases. So what are the consequences of these drivers that will characterize Alberta for the next 5 decades? Continued loss of good soils. Our ecological goods and services continue to become fragmented, particularly our rangelands and our native prairies. Surface water continues to be reduced. Water quality continues to decline. And our remaining prairies and parklands continue to drop down in size. Now, one of the key consequences to all of that is loss of biodiversity. So that's some of the challenges we have in the future. So metaphorically, we're going to see a lot of risk capital come to Alberta, particularly in Calgary. Of course, some of it moves to Edmonton as we allocate it to various land uses. Much of that will be driven to the oil and gas sector, particularly bitumen up in the Fort McMurray area. So that's a key driver. Along with that risk capital that drives the hydrocarbon sector, particularly oil sands, into the future, requires a tremendous number of new people. So we're going to meet that need primarily through immigration. That's going to force the Edmonton-Calgary corridor to continue to fill in. Some of those people are going to want to live on the east slopes. So there's going to be a major trajectory there. And that area is going to receive the bulk of our recreational demand. Now, some of that oil sands is going to come down into the Edmonton area, the industrial heartland, for processing. So we'll see a node of significant development there. That'll be one of the key drivers in the future. It's important that we don't forget, and here we're looking at the map at our conventional oil wells, there's still oil to be removed and found. So we're going to go and look for that. And here's some examples of areas that may receive some of the pressure in the next 3 or 4 decades for conventional oil. And here we look at our existing natural gas wells, but there's more natural gas to be found. And here are some examples where natural gas may be found in the future, particularly on the conventional natural gas side. We need to remember that we've got the coal bed methane play. Horseshoe Canyon would be one example in the Edmonton-Calgary area, and that will receive a lot of attention. We have shallow gas in southeast, and we have an awful lot of deep unconventional gas along the east slopes. So those are some areas that are likely to receive a bunch more pressure into the future. So in the backdrop, we still have agriculture, still trying to get by, but it's being systematically and insidiously eaten over top by all these other land use practices, and we have the forest sector. So what we begin to realize is that we have the land use drivers, which in the future, the energy sector, the developers in terms of whether we grow up or out, and the developers have been pushing us to grow out, and we need to re-examine that equation and determine whether or not that's the best way to move forward. I don't think it is. The followers, however, are the food production systems, the cattle production systems, and the forest sector. These are no longer driving our economy. They are responding to the drivers, which is the energy sector and developers. So not surprisingly, these people and these land uses are confused and disoriented. They don't contain the political leverage to drive the province into the future, but they're very important, and they are being driven on by other land uses. Now, the consequences of this is changes in soils and water quality and water quantity and carbon, biodiversity, so some key issues there. Now, Alberta produces a scale of commodities that's almost unparalleled anywhere in North America. And some of it is for our domestic consumption, but the majority is for export. So we're seeing most of it move out of the province, either to other provinces in Canada or internationally. And some of it, of course, is for domestic consumption. So we need to be asking ourselves, is if all of these land uses without exception create benefits and liabilities, and they're draining down our ecological goods and services bank account, why is it that we are so dependent on export? Do we need to continue that level of production for export purposes? What is the proper balance? So we need to be asking ourselves, we're trading off, as we withdraw our stocks of water quality, water quantity, carbon, soil, and biodiversity, so that we can produce natural resource commodities at vast quantities for external consumption. So this graph does a wonderful job of showing us the total amount of risk capital in the entire province of Alberta for essentially every major thing we build, whether it be a road or a hospital or a school or an industrial plant, of all of our land uses. And you see that it's grown exponentially. Yes, and it did fall down a little bit at the global economic crisis a few years back, and it's subsequently recovered. And you get to see from the colors that the hydrocarbon sector has clearly been the land use that's driven this economy. So Alberta has very much got a petrochemical-driven economy. To summarize, one can look at Alberta's land use as the following model. We have an amazing ability to recruit risk capital. So money comes flooding into Alberta from all the people that want to invest in all the land uses. But we're short of people. So we also work hard to bring new people into Alberta. So we have significant immigration. So we have lots of money and an increasing number of people looking for work. So we run those two components through a natural resource production system. And what that requires us to do is draw down on the accounts of water quality and water quantity, carbon, air, plant communities, and even our non-renewable resources like hydrocarbons and our agricultural soils. And that allows us to produce commodities. And that is what has given us, quote, the Alberta advantage. That's what has made us remarkably rich in that traditional view of economic performance relative to many other provinces or other countries. But Albertans are awakening to a realization that as all of these land uses and commodity production grows, they grow at the expense of our natural resource bank accounts. And as we begin to understand that, I think there's an awakening in Alberta that really true economic performance is going to require us to manage both sides of the equation, that as our natural resources bank accounts are diminished, so is our true economic performance. So yes, we need commodity production, but we need to balance that with also maintaining our bank accounts of water and air and carbon, soils. So historically, there's been this imbalance. There's been way too much emphasis on the benefits of land uses, the jobs, the royalties, the rents. Yes, those are important, and any economic performance system needs to recognize those. But we need to balance the equation and also look at the non-monetary components. So Alberta has undeniably led the entire country in terms of GDP. But at the same time, we have been seeing a slow incremental decay in what we call genuine progress indicators when we look at a broader suite of social, economic, and environmental indicators. So Alberta is not necessarily the best place to live. Yes, if you want lots of money, and if you want to look at economic performance for today's generation, but maybe not in the future. But there's more than just jobs, royalties, and rents. We have to look at a broader suite of indicators. As shown in this slide, we have paid a price. We paid a price in soil's quality, in soil quantity, in organic carbon. We've paid a price in terms of the loss of these small bodies of water, both moving and standing, that have been systematically drained to enhance agricultural production. We've paid a price in terms of the amount of water that's left in rivers, or the quality of that water. Not too long ago, a generation and a half, people readily swam or bathed in Alberta's surface water or drank it without chemical or physical treatment. And today, much of Alberta's surface water we won't swim in, and certainly we won't drink it without treatment. We have seen a massive transformation in our native plant communities, particularly grasslands and parklands. And we've seen significant reduction in biodiversity throughout the white area. So that's the trade-off. Exceptionally wealthy in terms of jobs, royalties, and rents, but our ecological goods and services have not fared so well. So I think Albertans are looking for leadership that says, yes, we want a pro-business approach to Alberta, but one where we internalize a bunch of things that have historically been sitting on the cutter's table and fallen off, and it sits on the floor today. So things like water quality and quantity and carbon and biodiversity, we can elevate those and put them on the table as true indicators, along with things like food and settlements and fuel and fiber. And essentially we're looking for decisions by the government that allows us to optimize both components of the equation. And a challenging aspect of this is that it will require trade-offs. It will require us to have a conversation about limits, thresholds, risks, and knowledge. And that's the challenge for us in the future as we move forward. So we need to balance that triple bottom line equation. Yes, Albertans want jobs, royalties, and rents, but they also want water quality, water quantity, carbon, biodiversity, and air quality. So we need to balance those. So that'll require some new economic models. Unfortunately, historically, the only way farmers make money is to sell crops, or cattlemen to sell their beef, or loggers to sell wood fiber. And other aspects of the true economy, such as water quality and quantity and carbon and biodiversity, are not even part of the equation. So we need to change those economic models. We need to arrive at new economic instruments that pay people not only for the production of things like crops or cattle or wood fiber, but also pay them for the provision of water quality and quantity and carbon. And so induce correct behavior and arguably punish poor behavior. So true economic performance in Alberta is, yes, GDP, but it's also recognition that GDP requires the draining of ecological goods and services. And so we have to manage that trade-off. So in addition to GDP is ecological services product. And if you take ESP, ecological services products, and add it to GDP, gross domestic product, you get true economic performance. And that's what future Albertans, our grandkids, want or will want of us today, is to have the vision to build policy that takes Alberta from where we are to where we want to go as we move towards true economic performance.